Hey, it's Professor Grabowski, and this short video is a crash course on something all writers, including journalists, need to be good at: grammar. Now, this is just a crash course. I'm not going to attempt to teach you everything about grammar. If you're taking my journalism class, you've probably been in school for 14 or more years, so hopefully you have a decent foundation in the English language and its usage. So today's lesson will focus only on the grammar issues that most commonly arise for journalists. As I've discussed in other videos, writing in journalism is quite different than writing for an English class. But many of the fundamentals you learned in English class still apply to journalism. Before you can be a good journalist, you need to be a good writer, period. And that means having a strong grasp on grammar. Writing should be clear. You may know what you mean, but do others? Having grammar rules ensures consistent interpretation. But poor grammar turns off readers and leaves them confused. Brushing up on grammar is particularly important for young journalists. If you were born after 1985, you probably spend a lot of time communicating online. Consequently, you may have developed some bad writing habits. Writing that is acceptable in text messages to your friends is not usually suitable for your journalism stories. So in today's lesson, I'm going to provide 5 tips that will instantly improve your journalism writing. And then I'm going to cover some common grammar mistakes many young journalists make and give you tips on how to avoid them. So let me begin with 5 tips to instantly improve your writing. First, mix up sentence lengths. Experienced journalists use a variety of sentences to make their writing interesting and lively. Too many simple sentences, for example, will sound choppy and immature, while too many long sentences will be difficult to read and hard to understand. So you want to have a mix of short, medium, and long sentences in your story. A simple sentence, also called an independent clause, contains a subject and a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. I posted a couple examples on the screen. Some students like to study in the mornings. Juan and Arturo played football every afternoon. Now, in contrast to those short, simple sentences on the screen, compound sentences tend to be longer because they contain 2 independent clauses joined by a coordinator. Coordinators are words such as for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. I posted a couple examples of compound sentences on the screen. First one, I tried to speak Spanish and my friend tried to speak English. Another one, Kyle wanted to be alone, so John went shopping. As you can see, both of those examples contain 2 independent clauses, and they're joined by a coordinator. My second tip is to use pronouns. Pronouns can be substituted for a noun. For example, my name is Mark. Pronouns used to describe me instead of my name include he, him, the professor, the New Yorker. You get the idea. Why should we use pronouns? Well, consider this sentence on the screen, which does not use any pronouns. Because Dr. Carter's mother faints at the sight of medical instruments, Dr. Carter has to drug Dr. Carter's mother secretly every time Dr. Carter takes Dr. Carter's mother's temperature. That sounds pretty bad, right? Now let's try replacing Dr. Carter with some pronouns. Because Dr. Carter's mother faints at the sight of medical instruments, he has to drug her secretly every time he takes her temperature. That sounds much better, right? So use pronouns. Okay, here is my third tip for improving your grammar. Write in active voice. Sentences can either be written in active voice or in passive voice. Note, this is different from past tense and present tense, which we will cover next. Voice refers to how a subject and verb are arranged in your sentence. In active voice, the woman or person is doing something, but in passive voice, something is being done by the person. Let me show you what I mean by some examples. Let's say a group of students take an exam and they don't do well on it. You could express that in passive voice by writing something like, the exam was failed by 1/3 of the class. The action or verb here is the exam being failed, and the subject is the class. So passive voice has the verb or the action before the subject or the agent doing the action. We can change that same subject to active voice, though, by moving the subject to the front of the sentence before the verb. So it would read something like this. 1/3 of the class failed the exam. Do you notice the difference between these two sentences? You should notice that active voice is shorter. It has fewer words if you count the two sentences. And it sounds better than passive voice. So in journalism and most types of writing, it's generally better to write in active voice instead of passive voice. There are some exceptions. For example, if the action is more important than the person doing it, you might write in passive voice. For example, let's say Congress passes legislation that makes college free for everyone. In active voice, you'd write Congress passed a bill that makes college free for everyone. But in this case, I would argue that it's better to begin with the part about college now being free rather than Congress passing the bill. So I might consider making an exception here and using passive voice. A passive voice version of that might read, college will now be free for everyone thanks to a bill passed by Congress. But 90% of the time, it's going to be better to write in active voice. So that's a summary of passive voice versus active voice. And again, it refers to how you arrange your sentence. Now let's talk about verb tense. As you should know by now, if something happened in the past, you use past tense. For example, you might say Barack Obama won the 2012 election. You don't say Obama's winning the election or Obama wins the election because the election already happened in the past. But often I'll see journalism students use present tense for verbs when referring to something that happened in the past. For example, they will write Adelphi University opens the Nexus building, which is incorrect because the Nexus building has now been open for years. You should only write in present tense when something is happening in the present. I think this mistake happens because news media like to write headlines in present tense, even when something happened in the past. But the actual text of your story needs to be in the appropriate tense. And in journalism, we're usually reporting on things that happened in the past. They already happened. So using past tense is usually the appropriate verb to use. My final grammar tip for news writing is to write in third person and never write in first person. Third person is used to talk about someone. You use pronouns such as he, she, and they. First person is used to express our point of view. So we use pronouns like I and me and we and our. Remember, as a news reporter, it's your job to be an objective observer. You need to keep yourself and your opinion out of the story. So there should never be any first person reference in your story. You should never write something like, I had the chance to interview this person, or this person told me that blah, blah, blah. That's a first person reference. Instead, use third person. Write stuff like he said, or she said. Okay, now that I've covered some things you should do to improve your grammar and news writing, let me address some common mistakes you should avoid doing. First, be careful to avoid comma splices. A comma splice occurs when you combine two independent clauses with a comma instead of a coordinator, such as but or and. Take a look at these examples on the screen to see what I mean. Tom attended Adelphi University, comma, he played on the soccer team. That's a grammatical mistake. You can't combine those two ideas, Tom attended Adelphi University, with he played on the soccer team, by just using a comma. However, you could rewrite this sentence to make it grammatically correct. For example, it would be correct if you wrote this, Tom attended Adelphi University and he played on the soccer team, or Tom attended Adelphi University where he played on the soccer team. Now look at the second example. Anita watched the movie, comma, Julie read a novel. That sentence contains a comma splice, but you can fix it by eliminating the comma and adding a word. For example, you could instead write, Anita watched the movie while Julie read a novel, or Anita watched the movie, but Julie read a novel. The next common mistake to watch out for is a run-on sentence. Run-on sentences are basically sentences that are really long, which makes them difficult for the reader to process. Once a sentence extends beyond 20 or 25 words, it risks the danger of becoming a run-on sentence. Even if it's grammatically correct, the sentence is so long that it's difficult for readers to follow. So a good rule of thumb is to make sure none of your sentences are longer than 20 words and certainly not longer than 25 words. Once a sentence hits 20 words or more, you need to either try to rewrite it to express it more succinctly or break that sentence up into 2 shorter sentences. The third thing to watch out for in your writing are sentence fragments. These are sentences that are not complete sentences. Rather, they only contain part of a sentence or a fragment of a sentence. Look at the examples on the screen. The President of the United States. Well, what about the president? What did he do? This sentence is missing a verb. Next example. Voted for the proposal to make college free. Well, who voted for this proposal? It doesn't say. This sentence is missing a subject. And look at this example. After the rain stops. Well, what happens after the rain stops? This sentence is not a complete idea. Okay, moving along. Another common mistake young journalists make is confusing who with that. If you're referring to a person, you need to use who, not that. For example, you would write, Maria is the student who received an award. You would not write, Maria is the student that received the award. So again, make sure to use who whenever referring to people instead of the word that. Well, we're almost at the end of our lesson. Here are a few more things to avoid in news writing. I often see students capitalize random words in their stories. For example, they might capitalize a word like student. But student is not a proper noun. Only proper nouns, which are the specific names of things, get capitalized. So the words Adelphi University would, both of those words would be capitalized because that's referring to a specific school. You'd capitalize the A in Adelphi and the U in university. But the word university, just by itself, or college or school, are just common nouns that could be used to refer to many different schools besides Adelphi, and therefore would not get capitalized. When in doubt, just use lowercase. Also be careful with apostrophes. For example, an apostrophe is usually used to show possession, right? If I say that's, Mark's wallet, I'd write M-A-R-K apostrophe S to show possession, that's my wallet. But you don't use an apostrophe when you want to show possession for the word its. So its without an apostrophe is used to show possession. If the word its has an apostrophe, it apostrophe s, then that's a contraction, which is short for it is. So be careful with that word and with apostrophes. In journalism, we also avoid using ellipses or a series of periods. Sometimes people like to use like a series of 3 periods or dots for effect, or sort of to suggest a cliffhanger or show that someone is thinking. But in journalism, the only time we use ellipses is if we are directly quoting someone and we have to trim down the middle part of their quote. The ellipses kind of show that we cut something out. Otherwise, we don't use ellipses at all. In journalism, we also don't use serial commas or what's commonly known as the Oxford comma. So if you have a list of things like red, white, and blue, there should be no comma before the word and. You would have red, comma, white, comma. I'm sorry. You would just write red, comma, white, and blue. Lastly, after you finish writing a sentence, just use one space before starting the next sentence, not two spaces. Okay, so we're about at the end of our grammar crash course here. Let me just leave you with some final advice. Make sure you proofread your stories. And proofreading involves more than just doing a spell check, which you should also do, of course. Proofreading means reading and rereading your work over and over, carefully looking for mistakes. If you do not review your work before submitting it, I guarantee it will have mistakes. No one writes a story perfectly on the first try. Even the professionals make mistakes. But I'm always amazed that each semester there are some students who don't bother to even run a spell check, let alone do other proofreading things. If you submit sloppy work in this class, you will not receive a good grade. And if you can't be bothered to read over your story, why would you expect others to read it? Remember that the assignments you're doing in my journalism class are not something you're submitting only for me to read. We're also trying to get these stories published. So potentially thousands of people will be reading your story. So you need to take pride in your work and make sure that it's error-free. A good way to catch mistakes in your writing is by reading it out loud. So you should actually read the words in your story aloud, like I'm speaking aloud right now. So don't just read it to yourself in your head, but actually speak the words out loud so that you can hear yourself speaking and others can hear you speaking. That will help you catch a lot of mistakes, like if you're missing a word in a sentence, or if you accidentally type the same word twice, or if a sentence doesn't make mistakes. Reading out loud will help you catch those kinds of mistakes. So you should get into the habit of always reading your work out loud, because it will help you catch so many mistakes that you otherwise will miss just by reading it to yourself silently. Finally, have others review your stories. Show your work to someone who you know is a good writer and who will give you honest feedback. For example, I often have my dad review my papers and columns because he used to be a teacher, and I know he will give me honest feedback. If something is wrong, he will let me know. However, I don't ask, other people to give me feedback because I know they'll say it's great, no matter how good or bad it is. So you want to seek out someone who not only is a good writer, but who you also trust to give you constructive criticism. As a newspaper editor once told me, the only way to become a better journalist is to have someone rip your work to shreds. Writing is a process. No one gets it perfect the first time, and feedback and constructive criticism are important parts of writing. Fortunately, at Adelphi, we have the Writing Center, where you can submit your writing assignments for free feedback. And you can even submit them online without actually physically visiting the Writing Center. So I encourage you to do that. Well, that's all, folks. Thanks for watching.